Hello my fiery friends, the Infernoman here with the hottest in budget deck technology. And for today's deck tech, join me once again on the journey, of course, where we are going to be playing the Ultra Budget Basically series. That's right, if you haven't seen these deck techs before, these are the ones that are going to be super short, but they get right to the point of showing you how you can play Magic Arena on the ultra tightest of budgets. How tight are we talking? You only need commons and uncommons. You do not need to spend any of your rares or mythics to play these.
So bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off.
So without further ado, join me as we now start taking our journey through the multicolored decks on a budget, as we are going to play a deck that I'm calling today, basically, Landfall. But before we continue, if you do like any of the content that I do, please like, follow, and subscribe wherever you watch the content so you don't miss out on any of the gameplay, booster pack openings, deck decks, and so much more. Longtime viewers of the channel know how we do it. We have to talk about the stats of the deck before we jump right into it. So, as you can see today, we're playing primarily Simic colors of mostly green and a little bit of blue. The average mana curve does look a little bit high, but you'll see why in just a moment. As for the remaining stats, we're looking at 20 creatures, 8 instants, 4 enchantments, and 28 lands. So as the name, of course, of our deck basically states, we're of course a landfall trigger deck. In other words, we're going to take advantage of the mechanic that is landfall. For those of you who are new players out there, this basically reads that your ability triggers whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control. Super awesome and easy to understand for newer players out there, because all you have to do is you just basically play your lands and cool stuff happens. So what exactly are we trying to trigger with the landfall ability here now that we just showed you Zendikar's Royal?
Good question.
Since I just brought it up right now, we're just going to talk about it straight out. Zendikar's Royal here is one of our main cards that's going to help us get to that victory. It's a 5 mana enchantment with the landfall ability that says, whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we create a 2/2 green elemental creature token. So we of course make these tokens and go super wide and over to overwhelm our opponent. However, we're going to definitely need a lot of landfall triggers to get a ton of elementals. Thankfully, of course, another card synergizes with that perfectly, which is the one and only Risen Reef. If you haven't seen this card before, we're going to talk about it right now. So this 3 mana Simic of 1 of any color and green and blue is an elemental 1/1 that reads, when Risen Reef or another elemental enters the battlefield under our control, you look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you can put it onto the battlefield tapped. If you don't, you put the card onto the battlefield, you put it into your hand. Simply put, once again, this combo is super hilariously awesome when it does go off. In other words, you put down the Zendikar's Royal, you have a Risen Reef. Once you get another land to go off, that'll create an elemental creature token, which will trigger off Risen Reef, and basically, ideally, it can repeat until you almost deck yourself out here. Just be very careful, you actually could deck yourself out with this deck. Once you get that combo going, that basically means it's game over for your opponent, and you most likely are gonna get a win. So with our combo being plan A, we'll talk about again the support pieces around that. So we have, of course, a need to constantly get more lands out. So we use Growth Spiral here, which can help us draw a card and put another land on the battlefield. Sweet, of course, because you don't actually need to be a basic land, it can be any land that can just enter. Tangled Fluorohedron here is super awesome for us because it is both an elemental and a tap land. So if you need to trigger off either the Risen Reef's ability by making an elemental, you can bring it in as an actual creature. If you need to have it go off as a land with Zendikar's Royal, same thing, it'll still trigger off, which is extremely awesome and flexible for us. And then jumping over to the bigger side of the spectrum here, we also have Beanstalk Giant. This is actually a super awesome 2-in-1 card. So of course, on the front side here with the sorcery ability, we basically can search for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield. What's super awesome about this is it comes into play untapped. That's also a big deal for us because that can help us, of course, get more spells cast in a single turn. Also, of course, the big side is the Beanstalk Giant itself, which its power and toughness are equal to the number of lands we control. As well, of course, we have a jumbo amount of lands, we definitely can make this a really big giant, which can be very hard for our opponent to beat and give us a plan B to the deck in case of, say, maybe if we can't go wide, we can go super big with the giant. But what if all of this falls apart? What if you can't go wide or you can't go big with a giant or your elementals?
Good question!
Well, of course, the deck has a plan C to the deck, which is going to be Ruin Crab here. Some of you who have played against mill decks know what this card is, but for those that don't, it simply is a little crab with 0/3 that's 1 blue mana, and it has landfall that says, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent mills 3 cards. Of course, we only have 4 crabs in this format, so we only are a little limited to this plan. However, we have one more final card here that ensures that we can be super flexible with any one of our creatures to ensure we can be much more consistent with what we're trying to do. And that is going to be Mirror Image. This simple little shapeshifter basically enters the battlefield as a copy of any creature we control. So if we need another copy of Risen Reef to ensure the combo goes off, we can do that. If we need a copy of Beanstalk Giant to go super big, we can do that. And you get the idea now. Basically, if you need another crab, you can just throw it out there, of course, as an expensive crab, but of course, it can allow us to just ensure that our combo will go off. Finally, the last support piece and the only support piece we can afford in the deck is going to be Royal Treatment here. This simple little instant allows us to, of course, give any one of our creatures hexproof until end of turn, and then we add a Royal token attached to it. A Royal token just basically means it's an aura roll that allows our creature to get a +1/+1 and ward 1. We don't really care about the +1/+1, but that ward 1 can be very annoying against certain opponents, so it gives us a tiny little bit of protection for any one of our creatures that may need it to get the final swing in against our opponent. And finally, of course, since we are a landfall deck, we definitely have to have a lot more lands than normal, so that's why we have 28 completely in the deck. We're going to go straight down the middle and split it with 9 islands, 9 forests, some Thornwood Falls to give us a little bit of life gain, Broker's Hideout also to give us some life gain, and also extra triggers, of course, with the landfall abilities, and then finally a Field of Ruin here if we need to pick off any kind of pesky creature lands that our opponent may have, but also it can help us, of course, trigger off by giving us another land in the same turn. Now, as far as strategy for the deck is, basically it just comes down to get your Risen Reef and Zendikar's Royal out as fast as you can. So you're going to use your Growth Spirals, of course, and your Tangle Fluorohedrons to ramp yourself up. So that way you should be able to cast them out ideally by turn 4. If you're good, maybe even turn 3. But turn 4 tends to be the most likely turn you're going to get out the Zendikar's Royal. With that, of course, hold on to your Mirror Image and your Royal treatments and make sure to adjust your game plan accordingly. You might run into some decks where are going to be super happy to get mill going, so your Ruin Crabs might not be the best option for you to copy. On the other hand, Risen Reefs tend to get blown up very quickly, so sometimes you might have to flex and then use your Mirror Image for something else, such as a Beanstalk Giant. Of course, the fact that we don't have that many creatures in the deck, each one of them is very critical to the game plan, so you're going to have to flex depending on what your opponent is doing. Now, if you are able to get the combo off, and it kind of sometimes can go off on its own, just be aware that you might end up in a situation where you might end up decking yourself out a little bit, so be careful of that if you don't want to do it too often. Just only put out 1 or 2 copies of each of these cards, so that way you don't overdo it. However, remember that the ability, of course, with Risen Reef allows you to May, so that means you don't actually have to then put that card onto the battlefield tapped when the land would otherwise continue the cycle and keep triggering. So if you need to slow it down, just go ahead and put it back into your hand so that way you can stop the combo and ensure that if you have already enough tokens out, you can just do your swings and get to victory. With that, as I mentioned before, the Royal Treatment, you only have that as your protection, so save that until you absolutely have to protect your most critical piece on the battlefield, whether you just need the crab to survive a turn, or your Risen Reef, or the Beanstalk Giant. Know that, of course, with this deck, the biggest weakness, of course, is if your opponent has Enchantment Hate, your Zendikar's Royal will have a bad time. If your opponent has a lot of Wraths, you're also going to have a bad time. So those are the biggest 2 things that are going to stop your game plan from doing anything. However, it's not too often you're actually going to have Enchantment Hate in the main deck, so Zendikar's Royal for the most part tends to be pretty safe. Even if you do get Wrath, remember that you have a ton of lands, so even a couple of land triggers will then get the cycle back on its feet. And if you are a fan of this style of gameplay, obviously I'm going to throw up on screen a couple of previous deck techs I've done over the years that show you more or less what you can do to semi-upgrade the deck and have a lot more fun with it if you are interested. These are all still pretty viable for what they can do. There might be a couple tweaks that you may have to throw in there because they are slightly outdated, but even so, I can assure you that they still are very effective in what they're trying to pull off, similar to the ultra budget game plan that we just showed you today. But with that out of the way, here are my final thoughts I just want to give on the deck. I did have a lot of fun putting this together, and I am very passionate, of course, about building even more of these ultra budget decks out there for those of you out there who are interested in playing Arena, but again, don't want to spend the time to then either grind out for more rares or mythics. For those of you out there who just want to play casually, or just want to again see what challenges you can face if you just want to play something with the limitations of only using commons and uncommons, definitely these are the decks for you out there. But with that, if you are a fan of the landfall trigger mechanic, if you are a fan of going super wide with a ton of tokens, if you're a fan of combo decks out there that can either flex and again be either go wide, go big, or just mill your opponent out of nowhere, by all means, definitely give this deck a try. It was a lot of fun when it goes off. You'll definitely be surprised at what the deck is capable of, and I assure you, you will not be disappointed. That's all I have for you today. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and just remember that no matter what you do play in the game of life, always be sure to burn bright. Later.